So yeah, let's begin. We are obviously living in an age of populism. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, populism uh, has really grabbed the imagination of the world, it would seem, particularly in the United States, as we know, the UK, throughout Europe, particularly in countries like Poland and Hungary. But you also see it in the global South. There'll be a paper, I think, later in the panel on Turkey. The regime of Narendra Modi has been characterized as populist, and the government of Duterte in the Philippines. So you have this sense that populism has sort of swept the globe in the last couple of decades at least. However, there's also been a kind of populism of the left. Right? The Arab Spring was widely regarded as a broad-based, if short-lived, popular revolt, and therefore as a kind of populism in the streets in 2011. The events of Tahrir Square profoundly inspired the Occupy movement, radiating out beyond Zuccotti Park in New York City. The movement spread through much of the Western world. Arguably, the Occupy movement's most significant and enduring effect was to be felt 5 years later in the rising support for Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. Now, while both of those, let's say, figures have now, in a sense, their prominence has waned. There's been a kind of lasting effect, particularly in the United States, with the development of a renewed interest in socialism, for example. We've also seen, of course, a populism of the left in Latin America, haven't we? With the Bolivarian model of Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia, as well as the Kirchner governments in Argentina. So the dramatic global rise of populist parties and movements, and this is why this conference is so important, because it has this kind of international and global perspective. This dramatic global rise of populist parties and movements has resulted in a burgeoning scholarship on this most slippery of political concepts. But how can we understand populism with more precision? How can we account for its recent pervasiveness? I'll focus on two exemplary accounts of populism before trying to arrive at some conclusions of how to understand the difference between right and left forms of populism in the context of globalization. The first account is a widely cited and widely discussed empirical study by Norris and Inglehart. The second is a more theoretical account of populism by Ernesto Laclau, articulated over several decades. If Norris and Inglehart struggled to come to terms, and this is my argument, if Norris and Inglehart struggled to come to terms with the populism of the left, then Laclau struggles to come to terms with the populism of the right. The former draw upon a somewhat narrow definition of populism, emphasizing its anti-establishment, authoritarian, and nativist dimensions. The latter understands populism as a logic constituted by the establishment of what Laclau calls an equivalential chain of different demands. It appears to suggest that populism is inherently a democratic, horizontal, and egalitarian discourse, somewhat ambitiously, I think. So, populism explained, is it economic insecurity or cultural backlash? As I mentioned, the widely discussed first paper and then book by Pippa Norris of Harvard University and Ronald Inglehart of the University of Michigan suggests, following Cass Mude, that populism shares three distinct elements. Right? The first is that it's anti-establishment. The second, that it's authoritarian. And the third, that it's nativist. The first contrasts with the established structures of representative democracy. The second contrasts with the principles of liberalism, in particular with the protection of minority rights, and emphasizes the direct expression of popular will via charismatic leadership, referenda, plebiscites, etc., that circumvent the typical checks and balances of liberal democracy. And this is really key, especially in places like Poland and Hungary. And as we saw in the United States, there's an attempt to really circumvent the checks and balances of representative democracy. And the third contrasts with cosmopolitanism. So building on Muda's conceptualization, the authors develop a heuristic model of populism based upon two distinct axes, the economic and the cultural. The economic has to do with the level of state management of the economy, and the latter has to do with conservative versus progressive values. The authors suggest three possible analytical types of explanation for the rise of populism. First, to focus on the rules of the game. Second, the supply side of the market of party politics. And three, the demand side of party politics. They gear their explanation to the third dimension and suggest that this can be understood to have two distinct, though not mutually exclusive, causes. The first is that populism emerges in response to economic insecurity, and the second is that populism appears as a backlash by older white males to the erosion of traditional cultural values. Okay? Again, so the first is that populism emerges in response to economic insecurity, and the second is that populism appears as a backlash by older white males to the erosion of traditional cultural values. And I think you can, for purposes of kind of international comparisons, you can plug in to older white males the existing traditional status quo in the given country that you're focused on, and a certain kind of let's say backlash by those elites that are fearful of losing power. I mean, elite's not the best word, but rather the groups that have historically had a certain claim to status and power. Norris and Engelhardt argue that the latter is the most convincing argument, right? That cultural backlash is the most convincing argument. And here I'm going to quote them. We believe that these are the groups most likely to feel that they have become strangers from the predominant values in their own country, left behind by progressive tides of cultural change, which they do not share. The silent revolution of the 1970s appears to have spawned an angry and resentful counter-revolutionary backlash. Today, here in the Indian context, you might be able to identify something like the criticism of anti-national, right? You are anti-national because you want to institute your strange and foreign liberal values, which we don't want any part of, right? You can maybe see that in this context. While the empirical data the authors cite to support their argument is indeed impressive, it is possible to raise significant objections about the way they frame this evidence. First, the separation of supply and demand side explanations seems dubious. In strictly economic terms, according to Say's laws of market, Say's law of markets, for example, aggregate production necessarily creates an equal quantity of aggregate demand. These, questions of supply and demand are not quite as simple as they suggest. The second objection arises from the cultural backlash argument. By mischaracterizing Muda's definition as inherently authoritarian and nativist, Norris and Engelhardt bias their conclusion towards culturalist explanations, right? So, in a sense, there's a kind of an explanatory bias in their argument. The third objection is that it is deeply debatable that progressive values are on the ascendant. Indeed, today it is far from clear what comprises progressive values. And we saw this, over 4 years ago in the Democratic presidential nomination that pitted Hillary Clinton, as we know, against Bernie Sanders, right? This opposition has been echoed in debates between political theorists in terms of the relative priority between a politics of recognition of identity, for example, versus the redistribution of wealth and a critique of inequality. So which side is the true progressive side? Right? This is a big debate now. It's not by any means clear. Now, whether populism can be understood exclusively in terms of traditionalist backlash is also debatable. If this was a predominant measure of populist politics, one could expect recent immigrants who themselves hold traditional values to the United States, to the United Kingdom, and other parts of Europe to join these movements. However, far from this being the case, they're often the targets of the backlash, right? So traditionalism in and of itself doesn't really explain very much. It's a certain kind of defense of traditionalism by nativist groups. Finally, one wonders whether the authors don't seriously underestimate the threat that authoritarian populism poses to the institutions of liberal democracy in the United States. I mean, I wrote this before the events of January 6th, right? You can see there the kind of threat that authoritarian populism poses. You see the threat in the way in which, while Trump lost the election, he captured fully the Republican Party, right? The Republican Party has gone fully Trumpian, right? And so there is a tendency amongst these political scientists to underestimate the power of populism in taking hold. And this is exactly what we're seeing in the United States. So the worrying inference, a worrying inference that the authors explicitly draw from their progressivist premises is that populism will eventually simply die out. The study therefore fails to sufficiently appreciate the ways in which populist governments seek to institutionalize their agendas. And we saw this exactly with the Supreme Court, right? Again, we now have the United States has a very conservative judiciary, and this is a key way in which an institution, entire branch of government has now been captured by the right. So the study therefore fails to sufficiently appreciate the ways in which populist governments seek to institutionalize their agendas, thereby changing the rules of the game. This has become most drastically evident in the case of Poland, in which Andrzej Duda, the leader of the right populist Law and Justice Party, has significantly limited the autonomy of the judicial branch of government. Right, and this is a key move: is to try to reduce and diminish the role of the courts, right, in checking and balancing the executive branch in particular, and maintaining the rule of law. All right. So understanding populist reason, another section, turning now to Laclau, in other words. In his hugely influential yet profoundly controversial work with Chantal Mouffe, entitled Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, Ernesto Laclau seeks to develop his analysis of populism so as to generate a new post-Marxist politics. In other words, Laclau is developing, and we must remember that he was writing in a British context, a political strategy that is germane to a context that has seen the rise of what Stuart Hall called authoritarian populism in the form of Thatcherism. Hegemony and Socialist Strategy differs from Laclau's earlier work in at least two ways. One, it breaks from Althusserian Marxism, particularly that of Nikos Poulantzas, insofar as it no longer accords the working class a privileged role in social transformation. And two, it provides a discursive account of society, or as Laclau puts it, the social. As he and Mouffe argue, quote, In our view, in order to advance in the determination of social antagonisms, it is necessary to analyze the plurality of diverse and frequently contradictory positions, and to disregard the idea of a perfectly unified and homogeneous agent, such as the working class of classical discourse. The search for the true working class and its limits is a false problem, and as such lacks any theoretical or political relevance, end quote. The continuity, however, lies in the fact that Laclau insists upon the centrality of the concept of hegemonic articulation, of heterogeneous political demands as the basis for a leftist political strategy. On Populist Reason from 2005, Laclau argues against those political theorists who claim that populism is an irrational political discourse by reconstructing and foregrounding, as the title suggests, populism's own distinctive reason. Its logic is that of what Laclau calls an antagonistic synthesis, but now understood as an equivalential articulation of differences. This means a linking together of what different political demands share in common in relation to a common antagonistic frontier. For Laclau, all democratic politics are in fact populist. In other words, if we assume that society is inherently heterogeneous, politics must entail the hegemonic articulation of a multiplicity of political demands in a manner that is always provisional and open to revision. A given hegemonic equivalential articulation of difference is always shifting, temporary, and open because it is based upon the logic of the empty signifier, in Laclau's view. The key difference from his previous work is Laclau's attempt to conceptualize the affective dimensions of politics via Lacanian psychoanalysis. As one theorist has sought to understand this, it's the articulation of a Gramscian Lacan in contradiction to Zizek's Hegelian Lacan, while the latter takes as its point of departure the understanding of the desire of the other, that is to say, the impossible because unattainable desire for intersubjective recognition. The former can be understood in terms of political desire. So the argument here is that what Laclau is doing is trying to theorize political desire. What does that mean? For Laclau, political desire is geared to what Lacan calls the objet petit a, meaning a partial object that is a fragment of the real, or that which eludes symbolization, yet is caught within the symbolic order. The objet petit a is often symbolized by the bountiful breast, and as such, and this is the key idea here, promises a return to an original plenitude or fullness, wholeness, prior to the symbolic order based on the split between signifier and signified. Political desire, then, is established through the name or the coincidence of signifier and signified that is only set retroactively. The key point Laclau is making here is that this Lacanian understanding of political desire enables an alternative to Freud's, the latter being mass politics grounded in the love of an authoritarian leader who represents the imago of the father. In contrast, political desire is grounded in the utopian logic of the objet petit a and is characterized by horizontal relations between brothers and presumably sisters. Right? So what Laclau is trying to do is to theorize through psychoanalysis a kind of populism that doesn't rely on this vertical axis to some populist leader, some kind of a father figure that binds the group together. He wants to think about the purely horizontal relations amongst members of some kind of populist movement. Now, several criticisms can be made of Laclau's approach to politics, to populism. Critics have drawn attention to its formalism, stemming from its reliance on structural linguistics, in which signification is understood by way of a system of differences with no positive terms. This formalist premise is the basis for his understanding of the figure of the people as an empty signifier. And this is a really important point, and I think one that's maybe more intelligible than his attempt, as I was trying to, explain some of the Lacanian aspects of Laclau. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to understand the figure of the people as an empty signifier that can take on radically divergent contents, given the nature of the differential demands that are articulated, let's say, within it. What the approach seems to elide is a historical continuity of the figure of the people. Secondly, it appears that Leclau thinks either we must conceive of necessity in reductive terms, that is, of a closed historical totality, or the social dissolves completely into an infinite deconstructive play of radical difference, and this is not tenable. Thirdly, Leclau also downplays the role of institutions in historical change and continuity. Can we understand the mechanism of articulation other than through institutions, such as the state, political parties, trade unions, and a whole host of other organizations and associations that constituted what Gramsci called civil society? Finally, and most importantly for our purposes, the above questions are raised by the Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis upon which Leclau depends to ground his account of populism, in particular to rescue populism from the denigration of the masses of figures like Gustave Le Bon, for example. Leclau's engagement with Freudian social psychology, however, must be regarded as a missed opportunity since he ignores the problem that occupies such an important role in group psychology and the analysis of the ego, namely the phenomenon of the aggression of the group through libidinal cathexis in the figure of a leader possessed of real or imaginary strength. Such an investment constitutes what Erich Fromm calls an escape from freedom. And you see in the movements that I mentioned earlier and the forms of populism that I mentioned earlier, both in the United States, UK, India, Turkey, Philippines, etc., we have this idea of a leader who's able to project strength, right? And can, in a sense, personify the people. Okay, I'm almost done. I'm coming to my conclusions very, very shortly. Then hopefully we can open it up for discussion. So differentiating right and left populisms. What I try to argue here is that we can look at populism in the context of neoliberal globalization, the various aspects of neoliberal globalization that, for example, David Harvey discusses in terms of accumulation by dispossession, deregulation, privatization, upward redistribution of wealth, and so on. And we can say that this process of globalization has increased both economic insecurity and cultural anxiety through the creation of surplus peoples, rising global inequality, and threats to identity. The anxiety wrought by neoglobalization has created a rich and fertile ground for populist politics of both the left and the right. Neither Norris and Engelhardt nor Leclau adequately account for such insecurity in their theorization of populism. As we have seen, populism can be understood as a mobilizing discourse that conceives of political subjectivity as comprised of the people, yet this figure of the people, as Giorgio Agamben has indicated, is deeply ambivalent insofar as it can be understood both in terms of the body politic as a whole, as in the US Constitution's We the People, or in terms of what Jacques Rancière calls the part that has no part, or the dispossessed and displaced, as in the people united shall never be defeated, or in the Black Panthers' famous slogan, all power to the people. In this dichotomy, the figure of the people can be understood in terms of its differential deployments by both right and left, which themselves must be understood in terms of the respective enemies through which the people is constructed. And this is my argument is that this is the decisive dimension of populism. It's how the people are understood, and the people are understood in terms of how the enemy of the people or the enemies of the people is to be understood, right? So this is key. Right populism conflates the people with an embattled nation confronting its external enemies. Islamic terrorism, refugees, the European Commission, the international Jewish conspiracy, so-called, etc. The left, in marked contrast, defines the people in relation to social structures and institutions. For example, the state, capital, multinational corporations, etc., that thwart its ambitions for self-determination. A construction which does not necessarily, however, preclude a certain kind of hospitality towards the other. Here, you can think of the the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, right? For the many and not the few. In other words, right-wing or authoritarian populism defines the enemy in personalized terms, whereas while this is not always the case, left-wing populism tends to define the enemy in terms of bearers of socioeconomic structures and rarely in terms of particular groups. The right, in a tradition stemming back to Hobbes, takes insecurity and anxiety as a necessary, unavoidable, and indeed perhaps even favorable product of capitalist social relations. It transforms such insecurity and anxiety into a fear of the stranger, and an argument for a punitive state. In contrast, the left seeks to provide an account of the sources of such insecurity in processes that have led to the dismantling of the welfare state, and the corresponding phenomenon, such as zero-hours contracts, the casualization, characterization of labor, and so on. It then proposes transformative and egalitarian solutions to these problems. Of course, left populism can also turn authoritarian in its own way, largely, though not exclusively, due to the interference and threatened military intervention of the global hegemon, the United States and its allies, with an increasing vilification of the opposition, as we had seen a few years back in Venezuela and Ecuador. So I'm going to leave it there. And perhaps the key question that can come of this is that we see the importance of social media in our everyday lives, in our business lives, professional lives. And we also see the way in which populist leaders are very adept at using social media. And one wonders whether there isn't a kind of affective bias in social media that orients it towards a kind of authoritarianism of the right, rather than this kind of analytic and rational discourse of the left. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your attention.